All right. Well, I'm going to be continuing our series today on the book of Daniel, and it's called Lies and Lions, as you just saw. But we've unpacked a number of different ideas over the last number of weeks. And so I just want to, if you've missed any of those weeks, or I want to help catch you up because we're building off each of these ideas every week. And so we started from this idea. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, welcome to Center Point Church, and you're trying to explore your faith, or maybe you're trying to start again, or you've been gone for a while, and so you're coming back and you're exploring the Christian faith, I want to say welcome. But you might not be familiar with this idea, but from a Christian perspective, when it comes to identity, the Christian perspective is that we don't gain our identity from self, but we are prescribed our identity. And it's not something that we self-define. It's something that is defined for us by the one who created us. And this has massive implications because what we do in our life and how we live, it comes from that identity. It's not searching and trying to find our identity in the things that we do. Unfortunately, much of identity culturally is wrapped up in three different ideas, and it's this idea that my identity is wrapped up in what do I accomplish. So all of you students that went back to school, maybe college, university, or high school, maybe there's even an elementary school student that snuck in here, who knows? But that our identity can get wrapped up in what we accomplish and in our grades. It can get wrapped up in what people think about us, and primarily, when it comes to social media, a lot of our social media is what people think about us, right? How many likes and how many people shared it and how many people commented, and were the comments good or were they bad? But we also have this idea of like our identity wrapped up in what we have. And so we look at what we have compared to our neighbors or compared to the people around us, and we're like, oh, I did something great based on what I have or what I accomplished or what people think about me. The problem with all three of those things is that things come and go. Sometimes our net worth increases and sometimes it decreases. Sometimes people like us and sometimes they don't. Sometimes we accomplish really great things and sometimes there's seasons of healing. And when our identity is wrapped up in those things, it's really challenging to navigate life in difficult seasons of life. And so the whole thrust of this series is if our identity is found in something greater than ourselves, well, chances are we're going to be able to navigate life's challenges and difficulties better. And so as we looked at Daniel's life, and if we look at Daniel's life and his friends' lives like we did last week, we see that there's extreme benefit to us having confidence in something greater than ourselves. And so the myth when it comes to Christianity is that as we follow God, as we put our faith and we put our trust in him, and Jesus invites us to follow him, that we lose ourselves. This is but it's a myth, it's a misconception. The truth is that in following God, we don't lose ourselves, but we understand and we gain our true selves. It's not that we lose our personality, or it's not that we lose our vibrancy. It's not that we lose our education. It's not that we have to lose our vocation and these are things, but that Jesus actually calls us to become our true self. To find our confidence in something greater than ourselves. To find our joy in something greater than ourselves. To find our happiness in something deeper than ourselves. And in that, we're called three different things. There's three C's. The first is this, is that our identity is found in the fact that we're called daughters and sons of the Most High God. That we're also capable, and that he gives us the strength to accomplish what he set out for us to do. He's uniquely wired and gifted all of us, and so in and of our giftings, we can rely in the strength and the wisdom of God. And he calls us capable to accomplish the things he set out for us to do. And the last thing is this, is that we're called complete. And that we find our truest self, our fullest self, as we come to the Creator. And he helps us understand that we are complete in him. That the parts of us that were broken, in the Christian perspective, due to sin, that we can find healing and fullness and wholeness. And so today we're going to talk about a key area of our life that distorts our identity. Now, full disclosure, most people will not go and purchase a ticket to what I'm going to talk about today. Like, you probably wouldn't go to a lecture on this, and so you're sitting there wondering, well, what is he going to talk about, right? But when it comes to this one specific idea, it's the one area of our life that I notice that in my own from my own perspective and for many other people, as I have been in ministry for almost 20 years, I've noticed that this one key area seems to hiccup a lot of people. And it's the area of pride. And pride is a preoccupation with one's own importance. And what we struggle with in a world that we live in today is there's so many things that we can get when we want, and we can choose what we want, and it comes at such a fast, high rate that it's hard for us to think beyond ourselves at times. I mean, think about the things we get impatient about when Amazon is a day late. You're like, do they even know how to do business? We recently moved to a new house, and our front door is a ways away from the front gate, and they've just been throwing Amazon boxes over our gate. And I'm like, is that how it's done? You know, but it's easy for me to get on my little high horse, you know, or skip the dishes. It comes a little cold. We get upset when we can't quite control the temperature in our houses or in our cars. It extends further than that, because then we go onto the internet and we get endless amount of information, right, at our fingertips. And if you can't find it, you just go to ChatGPT and you type in and you say, find this for me, and it gets you in seconds. I mean, we go onto social media platforms, and I found out this week, I'm not very good on social media, by the way. It's probably like my greatest weakness. I'm so grateful for that. Like, I'm just not, that's like, I'm so thankful that I'm bad at social media, okay? But I figured out from somebody this week that when you hit a like button, it shows you more of what you like, right? Well, why are you laughing? Right? This is the algorithm. The algorithm is surrounding me and what I like. And so it's hard to pull all those things. It's hard to pull ourselves out of that when it comes to how we view the world. Because so much of the world revolves around what we like and what we get, and the immediacy of how quickly we can get what we want. And what's challenging is that when we look at today's story, we're going to look at two different kings. And in many respects, the things that the kings would have had thousands of years ago, most Westerners have every single day. I mean, avocados. They showed up in the 80s in Canada. Did you know that? I remember my mom. She opened her first avocado, and it was incredible, right? And you go, that's ridiculous. You're so old, right? But the reality is that we have so much, and we're inundated with so much wealth, knowledge, material possessions, that it's very hard for us to see beyond what we want or what we even believe we need. Now, I'm not here to rail against the culture we live in and the world we live in. There's a lot of things that I partake in and I enjoy. But I think when it comes to our identity, and it comes to how we live in the world we live in, that I believe that Jesus offers a solution to some of the longings that we have, some of the unhappiness that we experience, and some of the things we believe will eventually bring us happiness or bring us fulfillment that leave us wanting and empty. Jesus has a great solution to. When I was 9 years old, this life-changing movie came out. And you're going to wonder, what is it? When I was 9, I got this VHS tape for Christmas. If you don't know what VHS are, they're a rectangle about yay big. And you'd stuff them in a machine. And they were equally frustrating. You see, today we complain about lag time, right? But then there was these incredible stores called Blockbuster Video, right? And what was their slogan? Be kind, rewind. Because you had to take your video and you either had to rewind it to wait to watch it again, right? And if you didn't bring it back, some of them even gave you a fee for not rewinding the VHS tape, right? Why? Because it was so painful, right? But I got this VHS tape, and my brothers and I opened it for Christmas, and this is what we got. This is the movie that we got. Can we get it up on the screen? Oh, yeah. All right? Tale as old as time, right? We all know it, right? Keep singing? No, I'm okay. I'm okay. Oh, it moved me the first time I heard that song, right, as a 9-year-old. Yeah, that was great. But we have the beast. And the beast is an image that shows up over and over and over again in the book of Daniel. Now, the book of Daniel, the reason that the beast keeps showing up is it's a less human version of the king or of the person. And what happens in Beauty and the Beast is the beast turns into the beast because one night, somebody shows up at his door. Now, he's kind of rejected people, and he's closed his home, and he's closed his fists, and he's locked people out, and he treats the people. He's a king, he's a prince, and so he treats the servants poorly, and on and on and on it goes. He's just not an incredibly great person, and he's prideful. So a woman shows up at his door, and it's raining and stormy, and she asks for shelter, and he rejects, and he says, no, absolutely not. Not you in my kingdom. And so I don't know where this lands. Some of you grew up in a pretty traditional church where you couldn't talk about sorcerers and witches, so you do what you want with this next part. But this lady, he closes the door, and before he can close it, she transforms into a witch and curses him to be the beast, and this is the beast. And then there's this flower that's given to him, and the petals fall off the flower. And as the petals fall to the ground, it reveals that the time is shortening in which, if the beast doesn't see transformation in his life, he'll permanently be a beast. And there's no way of going back. But it stems from his inability to see beyond himself. Now, this image is not just one that finds itself in Beauty and the Beast. It also finds itself in the book of Daniel and various other stories throughout history. Is that there's certain things in our life that make us less human and make others less human. And pride is one of those things that doesn't allow us to get to the core of who we are and to experience who we truly are and allow people to see us who we truly are and allow them to be who they truly are. You see, pride has this adverse effect of when we think just about ourselves, and there's nothing wrong with being proud of creating great work. But again, this idea of pride is when it becomes all about us. And so as we wade into these stories of these two kings today, this image of the beast will emerge. And it's, I think, an important image for us because it displays in us that there is certain outcomes to our life. And if we're not careful, that we can become something that we never thought we could. And what I love about the message of Jesus, and what I'm so thankful about, is that we have a heavenly Father that invites us into incredible life, that finds joy and meaning and purpose beyond anything else that we find in the world. So we're going to continue our story with the king of Babylon. His name's Nebuchadnezzar. And for the last 2 weeks, we've talked about King Neb. The first week he took over Judah, and he exiled all the best Judean their leadership, their male leaders, and he indoctrinated them into the Babylonian culture. And when they end up in Babylon, he reprograms them, and they say, no, we're not gonna change our eating patterns. There's some things we just won't do. And so the king gets like, I'm not so sure about this. And so they say, you know what, let's see how it works out. And they end up being okay and doing quite well. And so the king says, fine, you can keep your dietary patterns. And then Daniel ends up interpreting a dream for King Nebuchadnezzar, which is one of the exiled leaders. And as a result, King Nebuchadnezzar is like, wow, your God really knows what's going on. There's something here. And then last week we talked about Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who end up in the fiery furnace. And so they refuse to worship the Babylonian god and to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar. And so they get thrown in the furnace. God God sees them through that. And then as a result, then they have the king's ear. And so the king, eventually King Nebuchadnezzar says, wow, I can't believe you survived this. Your God is the true God. And that's where we're going to pick it up today. And so we pick it up in chapter 4 with King Nebuchadnezzar right after these three get out of the fiery furnace. This is where we start. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and the people of every language who live in all the earth, this is him saying this, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed, and this is a big one, for me. He wants everyone to know, hey, you know what? This is what God did. And then he continues. He says, how great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. And that sounds good. That sounds like a real big turning point. It's after this that King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And the dream is this, is that he has a dream that a tree touches the sky. And then the same tree gets cut down, and then the roots are just there, and the roots are covered in metal. And then in this dream, once this tree gets cut down, then an angel shows up. And then to further jump off that dream, this tree then becomes a man. And this man has everything stripped away, which is why the tree gets cut down. And the tree is a man who turns for 7 years as just the roots and then eventually begins to blossom again. Now, Daniel's already interpreted one dream, and so King Nebuchadnezzar calls him to interpret another one, and that's where we find ourselves in the story. This is what happens next. Then Daniel, also called Belshazzar, which is going to be confusing on the king in the next chapter, but bear with me, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Now, I don't know if this has ever happened in your life, but this has happened in mine where I'm like, please tell me what it is you want to tell me. And somebody's like, no, I don't know if you're really ready for that. Anybody had this moment? I don't know if you're really ready to hear that. And I'm like, no, come on, tell me. And then they tell me, and I'm like, oh, I had that happening in my life. That's about to happen for the king here, okay? So this is why Daniel's hesitating. Verse 20. And then Belshazzar answered, my lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies. I mean, that sounds pretty bad. And its meaning to your adversaries. The tree you saw, which grew in the sky and strong with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth. Let's go to the next one. With beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to wild animals, and having nesting places in the branches for the birds. Your majesty, you are the tree. And it's like the air gets sucked out of the room at this point. Because Daniel's already outlined, and the king's already outlined in the dream that the tree gets cut down and everything stripped away. And then he kind of softens the blow. Have you ever had to tell somebody bad news and then you soften the blow? This is what Daniel does next. He's kind of like, well, therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. I mean, renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness to be kind to the oppressed. It may be then that your prosperity will continue. So Daniel says, all you have to do is turn. You have to turn from the ways that lead to death. You just turn. Just acknowledge. And so you think, you know what? The dream sounds bad, and so he would turn. And this is what happens next. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, so we're talking a year. As the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, Is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? He's gone from at the beginning of chapter 4, a year earlier, saying it's by the grace of God, by the end of the chapter saying it's me. Now what happens next is equally interesting, because there's times that we can say the right things and our heart is disconnected. And it's clear that Nebuchadnezzar understands that there is a God, but he doesn't submit to him. And so look what happens next here. Immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. And then this is what happens next. Is Nebuchadnezzar is about to tell us, as he loses his power, as it's stripped away, as all of this has happened to him for 7 years, he loses everything. And after the 7 years, these are Nebuchadnezzar's words. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, I raised my eyes towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. And then I praised the Most High, and I honored and I glorified him who lives forever. He has this moment where he says, you know what? It's time. It's time for me to turn around. It's time for me to look up. It's time for me to acknowledge that even though I have this kingdom and even though I've done all these things and I have all these things, that I humbly say that, you know what, there is a God who I need to serve. And this is what he says at the very end, and this is interesting. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Now this is one king. What happens is Nebuchadnezzar, like most kings on earth, he passes away and another king comes in his place. And so another king emerges, and it's his son. And his son's name is Belshazzar, okay? Belshazzar, sorry. The two names are so close. And even though I practice this all week long, seriously. Belshazzar is now leading and will end up defending Babylon. What's happened right before we're about to head into the next chapter, and I need you to see this, is that there's two parallel chapters with two kings that both battle pride. The first one ends up saying, you know what, I needed to humble myself. God humbled me to the place where I could accept him. And then we have a second king, his son. And the second king has an army marching towards the gates. The Persian army is marching towards Babylon, and they're about to go to war. And so, like every great king, right, he throws a wild party. Instead of prepping and preparing and being ready to go, he's having a party. And not just that, but he's taken these goblets from the temple in Jerusalem, and he's drinking wine out of them. And the connection was that that what is sacred has now become profane. And so this king has turned his back, and it's supposed to model this turning his back on the ways of his father. And so they're in the middle of this party, and you can read about it if you want to jump through Daniel 5. I'm skipping through for some of time's sake, but in Daniel 5 you can read through it. But then suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared on this wall and on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. And the king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. There's this moment where all of a sudden, again, there's intervening that's happening. Belshazzar is here. There's a party. There's an army on its way. And God is here to intervene again. But the nation has turned away from the ways of his father Nebuchadnezzar. And then this happens next, because every time something happens, we need somebody wise to bail us out, right? And so this is what happens to the king as well. Then he said to those wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made from the third highest rule in the kingdom. And all of you are like, well, that sounds like a pretty good outcome. And so they're all looking around. Nobody can interpret it, but somebody, Belshazzar's wife, remembers that there's this person, Daniel, and I think this is important, who stayed true to his convictions, that was able to serve the kingdom well, commit with fidelity to God, and remains true and faithful. Through all the years, through kings coming and through going, he remains faithful and consistent. And then Daniel is then brought before the king, and look at this. So Daniel is brought before the king, and the king said to him, are you Daniel, one of the exiles of my father, the kingdom brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. Look what he says next. And then Daniel answered the king. I love this response. Now I want you to see this, because Daniel knows who he is. Daniel doesn't have to impress a king. Daniel's identity is found in something greater than himself, and so he can speak the truth without consequence. He can speak the truth with conviction without being worried about what's going to happen next, even though it may cost him something. But he says, you may keep your gifts to yourself. And give your rewards to somebody else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. And then he goes to interpret it. The words on the wall are many, many tekel parsons. Part of the reason I know that is as a kid I had to do a weird play about this. I grew up in a Christian private school, and it was, I remember, you remember those projector screens? Does anyone remember those things where like they have the light and it projects onto a wall? Oh yeah, and then we had the handwriting. It was hilarious because the person didn't know how to write backwards. And so, anyways, it just looked bad. It was a core memory. And it's irrelevant other than it connects to the story. But anyways, the words many, many tekel parson mean this. The God has numbered the days of your reign. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting, is the word tekel. And Perez, or parson, is your kingdom is divided to the Medes and the Persians. Clearly terrible news. But then Belshazzar's command says, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed on his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest rule of the kingdom, even though he said he didn't want it. What happens next is the king dies that night. It's a cautionary tale of two kings. One who humbled themselves and surrendered, and one that didn't. And in the case of the two kings, it was pride. Pride puts the creator in the place of the creation in the place of the creator. And it shows itself up in really difficult, challenging ways. And the reason I think it's important to talk about is that we don't talk about it. It's these things that live in the shadows that unless we have conversations about, they just never emerge. And so I think it's important for us to identify it, and here's why. Is when we find ourselves prideful, there's three things that kind of manifest themselves, and this is what they are. The first one is a critical spirit. When we find ourselves prideful, we get critical of other people. And it's hard because what's happened is we can even get, and I'm going to just talk, if you're not a Christian, you get off the hook on this one, but it's really interesting even as Christians that we can get prideful of what we know and what we don't, and feel like it's our job to be critical to a world around us. Now, we need to be critical in thought in terms of being thoughtful and being able to understand ideas, and ideas are very powerful things. They outlive kingdoms and castles and nations. They're powerful. Ideas are very powerful. But when we're critical of people, it's just not a good look. The second is this, it's self-deception. It's very easy for us not to see the things that we have going on in our life. And then we get lost in comparisons. And when we think about this, it's easy to get to a place of being proud. It's easy to get to a place, it's much easier to criticize somebody else than it is to make change in our own lives. It's easier to look blindly at ourselves and see in others' need. It was interesting because it's like I was at a lecture this week and somebody was like, hey, think about this type of person. And then you all come up with that person in your mind, right? Like, for instance, think about somebody who's really bubbly, right? Somebody comes to mind for you. But then you think about somebody who's really gloomy all the time. And you're like, oh, I know that person, right? But it's hard to see things in and of ourselves. But it's equally as important, and I would say very important, in the Christian faith to understand that we can never fully understand ourselves when we have an incorrect view of ourselves. And pride has a way of covering up what we need to change and masking who we truly are. And Jesus extends an invitation to us to become our truest self, to walk humbly in a world that needs help, not for the sake of being saviors ourselves, but for the sake of being an asset and being being people, agents of change in the world around us. And Jesus extends an invitation to us. And many of us struggle with the invitation because what it means is us saying we need help. We place control in the hands of a sovereign God and our Heavenly Father. And it's a relinquishing of control. You see, we don't lose ourselves, but what we do lose is the control we surrender. And so there's only two ways that I know how to overcome pride. And to be honest, I'm not great at it, but I'm getting better at it. And here's only two ways that I've been able to overcome it. One is by saying on a daily basis, God, I need help. And in doing so, I invite God into the story that and I say invite God. God invites me into the story he's already creating, and it allows me to partner with God in the journey. And so the first thing that I do is I look up. And if we're going to defeat pride and we're going to find our truest self and we're going to find a confidence in something greater than ourselves, we have to look up. It wasn't until King Nebuchadnezzar looked up that he was able to overcome his pride that was deceiving him and was taking an opportunity for him to make change in his nation. And it was robbing him of that. And it wasn't until God intervened. And what's interesting at the end of the passage is that he's very prosperous at the end of his reign. And in part because he turns his attention from trying to gain power for himself and he looks outward and he begins to serve the people. And so the first thing we need to do is look up, but here's the second thing we need to do, is we need to look out. I think we have a world that looks in and looks down. And what God calls us to do is to look up to him and to look out to the world around us. Because when we look up, what I've never found with God is condemnation. When I've looked up to God and say, I don't feel like I have this all together and I need your help, I've never had a response, either biblically speaking or in my time with God, where he's like, you are so dumb. His response is, you are so loved. And you know what? It makes me secure in who God has called me to be. And the way that I've been able to overcome the pride of my life is when I look up to God and I look out and serve the people around me. Not trying to get something from the world, but being for the world around us. Because it's so easy to look out for number one, but it's a game changer when we look out for people around us. I mean, think about it. Think about our church in context of the community that we're in. It's easy to come do the Sunday morning thing and then break into small groups and it be all about us, but God calls us to be in the world for the world. To look out and say, where can we be a difference maker? Where can I open up my home for somebody who might need an ear for me to listen? Who can I bring out to coffee? Or who can I send a word of encouragement for? Who can I give my money to? How can I open up my life? And as we begin to do this, as we look up and receive God's grace, as we look up and receive God's love, so too he helps us to share that with the world around us. And if we're going to be people that overcome the pride in our life, rather than devolving in a lesser version of ourselves, to step into the fullest of ourselves, we have to look up and say, God, I need help. And then to help the world around us. Now, I want to say this, because we're heading into a small group semester, and I love it. I love going out and doing different events, and I think it's really easy to say, well, what is the easiest step for me? And there's nothing wrong with that. I think we want to make steps easy. But I just wonder, what would it look like, church, if we head into our small groups semester asking this question? God, what do you want to do in me? Is there something in my life that as I head into small group semester that I need to ask people and invite them into this part of my story? And not just so that you can talk about yourself for 45 minutes, right? Because we do that sometimes and we're like, it feels good. but that we might lean in and say, is there anything in me, God, that you're calling me to change? In every season of life, in every year and every month, there's always something God is working in me. And you know what? It typically is around my pride. That I don't want to look weak, and it's hard to humble myself. But when I look up and I look out, it's amazing the things that God has done in my life when I posture myself that way in my prayer, is that you would do the same. That in this next season, what marks our church is, yeah, we want to do great things in the community. That's awesome. But it starts with an internal change. That God would do great things in us, that he might work through us. So, today is a day to look up and to look out. And if pride is something in your life, welcome to the club. It's something we're going to always be working on. But I believe that God's grace and his goodness is pursuing you. And when you say, hey, God, I need help, that he meets you there. And that's good news, because we all need it. Let's pray. God, I thank you today. I thank you that you lead us into new beginnings. God, I pray that today as we head out, that God, we know that there's things in our life that we get that we just don't necessarily see, and then they come to light and we're like, oh, I don't know. But God, you meet us there with your love and with your grace. And so God, I ask right now, I ask that you would encourage us, that shame wouldn't become part of our story, but as we admit what's happening, that God, we be met with love and your grace. God, we know that truth is a part of that. And so God, we ask that you would lead us. We ask for your help. We ask you to be a people that relies on you and reflects you in the world. God, help us to have that moment like King Nebuchadnezzar, to look up and say, God, you humbled me and you led me. So God, thank you for that. Thank you for this moment. Thank you for our church. And as we head into a small group semester, as we connect together and we meet together, God, would you use it to grow us as a people? Amen. I'm going to invite Christian up, but just before I end right now, yeah, Christian, if you want to come up, that would be awesome. Next week, you're not going to want to miss it. I'm pretty excited. We're concluding the series of Daniel, with Daniel in the lion's den, and we got a great testimony video. Actually, Jordan, who is on the drums, is sharing it with us, so it's going to be a Sunday that you don't want to miss. It's going to be fantastic. So I hope to see you next week.